have been two episodes that I've been most excited
Yeah.
about. And the first one was when we talked about the possibility that the plane went north, and we went through its entire potential path to get to Kazakhstan. And then this is the one that I've also been really excited about because it's about Blaine Alan Gibson, who we touched on in the last few episodes. This is the guy who found a whole bunch of pieces of alleged and real and maybe not real debris. He was like the luckiest guy in the world. So we're going to do a literal figurative deep dive on what he found and what the story is on this guy. And the more I read about it, the more it blows my mind. So I'm going to have a lot of questions for you.
He's a character. He's a character, and he's got just a crazy story. You know, sometimes you see these wild movies and you're like, it's called inspired by real events or something. This guy really is real events. He's real and unbelievable at the same time.
We've talked about how he was on your radar a year and a half before he found No Step. Just to recap, this is the guy who found that No Step piece, which kind of turned this case upside down.
Yeah. He swooped in pretty much out of nowhere. Like, I'd heard of him, but like almost nobody outside of very narrow MH370 world had heard of him. And he came in and he single-handedly revitalized the search for MH370 debris. Like, nothing had happened since that July, and by now it was like February, and nothing had happened. He came in, he found this piece, he became a worldwide sensation. He inspired other people to start looking for pieces. Sure enough, other pieces started to turn up, and he kind of caused a renaissance.
So paint a picture of this guy. I mean, like, he looks kind of like Indiana Jones. He's got the brown fedora. He's got the brown leather jacket.
Right.
He portrays himself as an adventurer and world traveler.
Right.
And he had already done a bunch of international quests, including an attempt to find the lost Ark of the Covenant.
Right. Well, how do we know this, though? It was because he went public kind of reluctantly, as you'll remember. He kind of came forward to a bunch of people who were interested in MH370. He sort of swore us to secrecy and said, don't talk about this. And then it kind of leaked out anyway because he'd been talking about it on like Facebook and stuff. I did an interview with him in New York Magazine. Other people started to call him. TV producers were calling him. Documentaries were calling him. He started going to Madagascar. This was now his full-time thing, was going around finding pieces of debris, but then kind of being the media face because he was this larger-than-life character. Yes, he was dressed up like Indiana Jones, and that was no accident. And he would tell this story about himself, as you alluded to, that he would say that he had inherited some money. He was a full-time adventurer, and he was traipsing around the world kind of in a very Indiana Jones way. He literally was in search of the Ark of the Lost Covenant.
And in fact, he didn't even get into MH370 until he saw all the CNN news coverage, he says. So in a way, I guess you inspired him because you were on CNN a whole lot back then.
Well, I don't know if it was me personally, but he described how his parents, I guess his dad had died a while. His dad was quite a bit older than his mother, but his mother died in the late 2000s. And so he had inherited the house, and I guess he had decided to sell it. And as he was packing it up, he had the TV on, and he was hearing all this coverage about MH370. And his telling, it got really into his imagination. He decided, I want to be, like, instead of searching for the Ark of the Lost Covenant, I'm going to search for MH370.
I mean, I'm pretty into it also, but I haven't like dropped my whole life to go traipsing around the world to do this in my Indiana Jones clothes.
In his telling, he was an adventurer. And so he was sort of at loose ends. He had no constraints. He didn't have a family or professional obligations. He had been a lawyer, but was retired. He had a whole bunch of money. He could do whatever he wanted. And so
good for that guy. So in fact, he went back to Madagascar after he got all this press attention. He went to Ile Saint-Maurice. Here we go with the French.
Right.
In June of 2016, he was accompanied by a crew from France to TV. Do you know how he made that happen, or did it just happen?
Oh, everyone was clamoring for him.
Some of this information we have from this online publication called Seattle Met. So let me read some quotes to you, and then we can kind of dive into what this means.
Right.
So Seattle Met author said, they rode quads along the beach, and at the north end, he signaled for the party to stop. The camera crew had a good reason to follow him. He is, to this day, still the only person to find a piece of Flight 370 while actually looking for it. And he had done enough research to have a good idea where he might find more. But come on, it was still a 1 in a million find. There's no way he'd actually uncover another, right? With the cameras trained on him, Gibson dismounted and started walking. As he got closer to the object that had caught his eye, he could see that it was gray fiberglass. It was almost a clone of No Step. Later, he found a handful of other pieces, one of which looked exactly like the housing for a seatback TV monitor. He couldn't be sure, but he had a pretty good idea they came from Flight 370.
Yeah. I mean, we have footage of this, which we can roll.
He's left behind the beaches of his native California to travel around those in the Indian Ocean. Dozens of islands, thousands of miles. The day after we arrive, we set off on a quad bike to explore the endless beach at Antisiraca. There are no tourists at the northern tip of the island. Tons of waste are regurgitated by the Indian Ocean over dozens of miles. An ideal hunting ground for Blaine.
This beach is a perfect place to search. This debris here, it could be from south of Maldives, it could be from off the south coast of Sumatra, Java Sea, or off the coast of Australia. It could be from anywhere. This is just junk from the ocean. Natural from a squid. These little bits of plastic, who knows where they're from. Fishing boats, large ships, they just throw all their trash overboard, and it floats around in the ocean and washes ashore here. That's where probably almost all of this stuff is trash from boats.
Blaine says he only needs two things to find plane wreckage in this open-air rubbish heap. His eyes and a little luck. It's a gigantic undertaking, but after 3 hours of fruitless search, Blaine stops dead.
Maybe.
At his feet, something looks like a plain wooden plank with a few intriguing details.
He found it. Not only did he find it once, he did it twice, and this time with TV cameras rolling.
With a TV camera crew rolling, which the writer of the piece found this kind of hard to believe. And when I read it, I was like, no way. This is one of these real Rorschach moments where it's like, some people are like, yeah, makes sense. I mean, and other people are like, come on, that's ridiculous.
I can't help but be in that camp of, come on, this is ridiculous.
Well, wait, there's more.
Okay. So he goes back later that year, and now he's got a delegation of like family members, next in kin. He's got documentary crew. Now we're looking at December 8th.
Yeah.
The group splits up. They're all combing separate areas. The camera crew follows Blaine. He's on another ATV. Didn't find anything. Turned around. He's making his way back. And then all of a sudden, he comes upon another piece of debris at the edge of the wet sand.
He's past an area he'd been like half an hour before, meaning that in the not only did he happen to be at the right place, he was at the right place at the right time. That's the exact moment that this piece washes ashore while a camera crew is rolling.
And he says, quote, appears to be Malaysia 370 interior cabin debris.
370 interior cabin debris.
Seriously.
And I mean, a thing you should know about Blaine is that he sort of had a tendency to be like, aha, look, it's a piece of MH370, without a lot of reason for saying that. And yet, and a lot of times it didn't turn out that there was like any reason to think it, or actually it was probably not. But a lot of times a lot of these things were actually later found to be either definitely from MH370 or quite likely from MH370. So he's a little bit overconfident, but he kind of gets a pass because he's right a lot of the time. But again, you have if you thought the first time it was incredibly implausible that he would find a piece. And remember, the first piece he found after only looking for 20 minutes, according to him. So he's just like a debris magnet. I mean, okay, I've talked to other journalists who find this not incredible. And they're like, yeah, the plane hit the water, turned into like thousands of pieces. There's like thousands of pieces to be found. And to which I say, okay. I mean, they did ultimately recover several hundred pieces of Air France 447, our eternal reference. But there's more than 2,000 miles of coastline in Madagascar alone. Think about the rest of Africa. Think about all the other islands in the western part of the Indian Ocean. Think about all the other parts.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just call it 10,000 miles of beach, of whatever. And then think about all the stuff that's just still floating around, or that went over to Antarctica, or who knows. So you have to wonder yourself, like, how big is the ocean? How big is the Earth? What are your chances that you're going to walk down the beach and find a piece of this one plane that crashed 2 years ago, 4,000 miles away?
So the people who participated in this search with him, the next of kin, had stuff to say also. So Grace Subathiral Nathan. Sorry for that one, Grace. A Facebook post. She said, it just shows how debris can be there 1 minute and gone the next, and vice versa. Yeah. So she felt good about it. But I seem to recall some of the next of kin were like, this seems weird.
Yeah, if you watch the Netflix documentary, there's a French gentleman who doesn't buy it. And I think that Blaine is a somewhat polarizing figure. And I've run into other people like this in my life, people who are kind of very charismatic, good storytellers, having sort of a silver tongue, and people either love them or they're deeply suspicious of them.
And you were suspicious from the beginning of this guy, but you kind of warmed up to him and then cooled down on him.
Before he found the pieces, I was like, we described it last time. Like the first things he came at me with were pretty crazy, but then, he seemed okay. And then I did a nice interview with him. He was very nice. And I wrote the piece very straight for New York Magazine. But I was definitely like, is this real? One of the things that bothered me at the time, but doesn't bother me anymore, the first piece that he found, the no step, it didn't look like it had anything on it. And as you know, I'd spent a lot of time thinking about how do marine fouling organisms grow. It seemed like if this had been in the water for 2 years, there should be a lot of stuff on it.
Yeah.
Later, we found out that there actually were things living in it, but they were like on the inside, and the outside had probably been stripped clean, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I would count myself among the camp of people who became pretty, not only skeptical of Blaine, but like honestly, pretty hostile. And I think I've alluded to this before, but I think like if you ask me like what is my least proud part of my involvement in the MH370 mystery, I think I kind of went off the rails with Blaine, where I was just like, I so couldn't believe it. And I think I got kind of frustrated, and I was like, I basically said, Blaine is blatantly planting pieces of debris, which in retrospect, I look back on it and I'm like, dude, chill. And if I could give one little piece of context about all this.
Yeah, please.
At the time all this was happening, I had worked for several years on a documentary about another larger-than-life charismatic guy named John McAfee.
Yeah.
And if you want to know more about this, you can see that there's a documentary that we made for Showtime called Gringo, The Dangerous Life of John McAfee. That project, frankly, kind of went off the rails. But the fact is that I spent a lot of time basically chasing down a charismatic psychopath and trying to demonstrate to the world that this guy was a fraud, and everyone loved him. He was very charismatic, but he was a killer and a rapist.
He was a bad dude.
He was a really bad dude.
Yeah.
And so this idea that like someone is coming along and being very charming, I really was kind of, I wouldn't say triggered, but kind of that way.
The reason I ask you is because you've been a journalist for a long time, and so have I. And it's sort of like a skill that we develop where you can tell if someone is lying to you or if they're blowing something way out of proportion or hyperbolizing. I can't put it on my resume, but I have at least in the many thousands of stories I've written and edited, I can sometimes tell if someone is not all that they say they are.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you do too, because you do a lot of investigative reporting and serious stuff. And you had just finished this McAfee stuff. So if you had a hunch that something was fishy about Blaine, I could see why you would have stuck with that.
So one of the things about John McAfee, like Blaine, he loved to tell stories. He loved attention. He loved the media, and he would tell stories that I would be like, no, that's not right. And the trick that I adopted was look for inconsistencies. Like, are these people telling stories that match consistently, and do they match independently verifiable facts? So with Blaine, I did have my skeptic flag up. Did he tell this story a different way, a different time? And if he did, then I'm like, okay, this is, I'm going to try to accumulate evidence of this guy bullshitting.
At the end of 2016, he had found most of the pieces that had been turned in. And it wasn't just about how much he was finding, it was about how he was finding it.
Well, wait a minute.
Okay.
Let's not swallow this.
Okay.
Because he had found most of the things that had been found.
Yeah, I should have paused.
By the end of 2016, various people around the world, or especially around the western edge of the Indian Ocean, people had been coming across accidentally, as they were strolling on the beach or what have you, finding pieces of debris. And we've heard some of these stories already. And more people continue to find things. But of all the things that were found, most of them were found by him in this kind of situation that we're talking about. Maybe he was with a film crew, maybe he's not with a film crew. There's footage that if we haven't shown it already, we're going to put it on screen of him either walking like down these long stretches of sand, either like walking or on an ATV or something. But it's just mile after mile after mile of millions of pieces of junk, garbage, debris, string, shoes, pieces of unidentifiable plastic. And he's looking at all this stuff and his eyes are lighting on pieces of MH370.
It's like a metal detector.
There are, not to exaggerate, billions of people that live on the border of the watershed of the Indian Ocean. Billions of people for every day, for a year, all their stuff going in. And that's the signal, that's the noise, that's the clutter. In amongst all that clutter and noise, you have maybe several hundred or 1,000 pieces of MH370 that have been floating for 2 years and then have washed ashore. And so you imagine, like, this is truly needle in a haystack situation.
Yeah, but like I was saying, it's not only that he was finding all these insane pieces in an insane sort of way. He also has these like amazingly like rich and folksy stories about, he in the seaside village of mainland Madagascar, he spots a 9-year-old girl using a scrap of MH370 debris to fan a kitchen fire.
Yeah.
And then another guy, he told this to The Guardian, when I put word around the village, another guy turned up with another piece he had been using as a washing board for clothes.
Okay. This girl, I think of this as the Lendra story. It took me a long time to figure out that her name was Lendra.
Yeah.
But this little girl, she was 7 years old. She actually existed as far as I can tell. And her name was Lendra. And Blaine was in a village in Madagascar. And he somehow spots a little girl using a piece of MH370 to fan a fire. Okay. Now, what kind of object do you fan a fire with? A flat object, a lightweight flat object. Like I sometimes use when I do my campfires, I will take like a newspaper.
Sure.
Or a magazine, or you could use lots of different things.
Yeah.
But how about a piece of MH370? Would that do the trick? Sure. But it's like, really? I mean, of all the infinitude of things that you could use because they're light and flat and you can flap it and make a wind over a fire, you happen to have a piece of MH370? That literally boggles my imagination. Madagascar is a very poor country.
Yeah.
It is I've been there and I was shocked at how poor it is. I do remember a story about somebody who was assigned to supervise some work at an office bureau of the Madagascar government, and when they got there, nothing was being done because they didn't have any pencils. Like, nobody had given them any pencils, so they couldn't do anything.
Okay.
So it is a bitterly poor place. But they're villagers living by the sea. They fish. They have their huts. They have
It's not like Castaway.
They're not castaways,
Okay.
and when he told this story about the guy who like found a piece and he was using it as like a scrubbing board, it's like, come on, they've got wood, they've got, pieces of metal. They're not like Stone Age. What kind of doubled down my incredulity was when I encountered him telling the story a different way.
I was going to say that because sometimes he mentions the girl, sometimes he doesn't. It's just there are all these different stories about the same thing, and that's why it sounds so fanciful to me.
So after I read the account in The Guardian, there was another account that he gave on a Facebook page where he talked about putting out the word at the village and people bringing in these pieces to him. No mention of this girl with the thing. And then there was another telling of it where he was staying at this woman's house and he was eating breakfast, and this little girl had a bag of toys, and she opened it up, and on the top of the bag there was this piece of MH370. And I was like, okay, Andy, I was talking before about, like, if you think someone is bullshitting, look for inconsistencies in their story. And so he told this story two different ways. So I thought to myself, okay, here is a story that I can check. I can find out if this is true. And so he had mentioned the village or the peninsula on this island. And so I actually called up some Westerners who were living in Madagascar, and I said, can we hire a guy to go there? And it's hard to travel in Madagascar. They kind of cited these crazy prices to me, and they wound up hiring like a local guide who like took a boat over there and found this village and found this woman. It was all like a little suspicious. I was trying to do it on the cheap, and so, but he said that he found this woman and the girl had died. Lendra had died. This was 2 years after the finding, but at this point, and Lendra was no more. But the mother said that Lendra really liked to collect stuff from the beach, and she had found this piece, and she had tons of junk, and she used to play with it piece because it was like a honeycomb, and she pretended that she was collecting honey. And so I don't know. A parenthetical I should add is that this particular piece, when the Malaysian authorities looked at it, they were like, this is not from MH370. So the whole thing is a bit of a red herring in a sense, but except that it does demonstrate that, if nothing else, why is he telling different stories about it? Why can't he just tell the one actual story? But then the other thing is, another thing worth noting is that the other piece he collected at the same time from the other neighbor who used it for a washing board, supposedly, there's turned out to be actually not only a real piece of MH370, but a really important piece of MH370. It turned out to be part of the nose gear door, and it collapsed in a really interesting way that I think we'll talk about in a future episode.
All right. So he did find real pieces. He found some maybe not real pieces, but he found them all in a very colorful sort of way that his description changed based on who he was talking to.
He's what they call in literature unreliable narrator.
All right. Well, let's talk about this guy. All right. So he's from San Francisco. He was raised in Carmel. He studied political science at the University of Oregon. He moved to Seattle and he got a job at Seafirst Bank. His
childhood is really interesting because his father was actually a historical figure.
Oh, that's right.
His father was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court.
Oh, that's even better.
Not only that, but he was the longest serving Chief Justice. And so he served for very, very many years with distinction. And one of his crowning achievements was overturning the law that allowed the government to throw Japanese American citizens into internment camps. And so he's he's a progressive, kind of a titan of California law. But he was really old when he met Blaine's mother. She was like a law clerk of his or something. She was like in her 20s and he was much older. This guy was 69 when Blaine was born. So he kind of really wasn't too present when Blaine and his mother, when they would go traveling around the world and stuff.
Okay, so he calls himself a retired attorney, but he didn't practice law. He worked for, this is the part I got wrong here. He worked for Washington State Senator Roy Moore, but he didn't practice law.
I mean, he kind of had this sort of peripatetic youth where he really does seem to be, I mean, he was probably brilliant. His father was brilliant. And his mother sounds like a character too, and he had all this energy and all this intelligence, and so he sort of dabbled in all sorts of things.
So his resume gets a little weirder after this, or a little more interesting even. After his short stint at the bank, he moved to Olympia, Washington he worked for the state senator, and then he joined the U.S. State Department.
Yeah. So he had traveled, as I said, with his mother when he was younger. And I think very early on, the international cultural, possibilities had its hooks in him. And he was fascinated by the world. He wanted to engage in the world. He joined the State Department pretty briefly.
1986 to 1990, age 29 to 33. You corroborated this. You actually called the State Department. They confirmed that he worked there. They understandably wouldn't tell you it was anything other than political affairs. According to the Met, he spent time with the rebels in Afghanistan, photographed there holding an assault rifle. I have a hard time believing the State Department was sent. I mean, they sent people to Pakistan back then, but they weren't generally sending them into Afghanistan at the end of the
Well,
Soviet
a friend
War
of mine
against
who
Mujahideen.
actually did spend some time in Afghanistan and Pakistan, he said that the State Department had a lot of people in Pakistan. It wouldn't send them into Afghanistan, but the CIA would. And, the way that they kind of do covers and everything. But I think it is worth noting, he was actually stationed for a year in, I forgot, Rio or something.
Yeah, Rio is what the notes say. So we don't have proof that he was in Afghanistan, but we do know that he was stationed in Rio.
Yeah, he was an actual State Department employee in the political side. But so, this is a guy who has legitimate credentials.
Which doesn't make him CIA at all. It's, in fact, I wouldn't even go there, but I think it's gonna come back that either he was involved in something covert or he says he was. That's my take on it.
He's in the world of international affairs. And there's a neighborhood of international affairs that's like diplomacy. There's a neighborhood that's like espionage. There's a neighborhood that's commercial, whatever. There's a lot, and they all sort of flow into one another. But
yeah, so his this is again where he is talking about his own resume, but you can tell if you believe him that he spent quite a bit of time in the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union. He says he was there in the late 80s when the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. He decided to capitalize on it. He lived for 10 years. He lived off and on in the newly capitalist Russia. He said he was a consultant to new business owners and making a lot of money that would finance his globetrotting.
So that's what he said to the Seattle Met when he first started talking to journalists. So this is right after he became famous.
Okay.
So at first he made no bones about it. And indeed, when he first talked to me, we were talking about it, and he said that, I spent time in Russia. In fact, I speak fluent Russian. And I was very interested in the famous mystery of the Tunguska meteorite, or whatever. They don't really know if it was a meteorite for sure, but he went to this super remote part of Russia where I'm sure nobody speaks English.
I can tell you that the first one was about 20 years ago when I was living and working in Russia. I was the second American to ever go to the epicenter of the Tunguska meteorite.
Oh, wow. You're the second American?
If it was a meteorite, yeah.
Wow.
And I trekked around there. I looked for something. I talked to people. I talked to scientists about it because I had access to, I speak Russian fluently. I had access to Russian scientists. Drinking vodka with them, they tell me what they really thought. So that was really the first one.
And he bragged about how he talked to scientists and talked to local people. And he could just, the thing is, Andy, you and I started to talk about this a little bit earlier. My assertion, as someone, I started studying Russian after MH370 happened for reasons that you can understand.
Yeah.
German, I found quite hard at first. It has its complexities.
Sure is.
Russian is on a completely other scale. It is, the Russian verb is a thicket from which you will never emerge. And I don't know, you seem skeptical about that. You think it's
I'm actually okay. So actually, I'm not skeptical about that at all because I found French to be relatively easy, despite my bad pronunciation in these previous episodes. I took German in college, and I couldn't grasp it at all. Like I just didn't go anywhere. So I went back to French. Right. I did try a little bit of Russian, and it might as well have been, Japanese or something. It didn't feel like anything Western whatsoever. So it is an extremely hard language to learn. So the idea that he could have just kind of picked it up on the side, that's unless this guy is a savant when it comes to languages, that seems unlikely to me.
Well, we hear him talking French in one of these documentaries that we played clips of before. He is bad. His French is awful. But here's the thing, and I think this is an important thing to talk about. When you learn languages, you're very painfully aware that there's different kinds of fluency. It's one thing to be able to read a newspaper.
Sure.
It's another thing to be able to watch a movie. And it's another thing entirely to walk into a crowded bar where people are going blah, 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 and there's music in the background, and they're talking really fast, and they're using slang, and da, da, da. That is the sort of apex.
Okay,
and he's saying that he can go into a bar in Russia and talk to the locals.
And make friends and get... Okay.
And pick up information kind of on the QT because he just is so fluent.
All right.
So this is like this is like deep level of in Russia.
Yeah. So he was in Russia in the early 90s when he was done with the State Department, and somehow he claims to be an outstanding speaker of Russian. If we've heard Blaine speak bad French, I'm still agreeing with you that I have a hard time thinking that in this short period of time he became so fluent in Russian that he could go into the bar and learn things, much less start his own business in Siberia.
We've established that he's an unreliable narrator. So we're trying to find independent sources of information to confirm it. And sure enough, if you try to do a little bit of digging, it doesn't actually take that much. It turns out that there are actually some documentable ties between Blaine and Russia. First of all, he has registered in the state of Washington a company.
He established a company called Siberia Pacific Company, which was based in his Seattle condo.
It was based in a Seattle condo, but who did he start it with?
Sounds like two Russians based on this article of incorporation here that I'm seeing. Mikhail Pilapuk and Sergei Kuznetsov.
Right. So Kuznetsov is a super, super common Russian name. It was impossible to find who this guy was. But Pilapuk is a more unusual name. And I spent not a huge amount of time, but some time trying to track this guy down. This guy has some kind of metal trading company in this it's sort of like the Ohio of Russia. It's like in the middle of Russia, and it used to be a steel town, and it's probably sort of half dying now.
Is this the kind of thing that American tourists just wander into and start businesses?
Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So.
And so he's starting this company with two Russians in 1992. The Soviet Union has just fallen apart. The company is just opening up to business and capitalism. This is when the country basically gets divvied up by the oligarchs, stripped for parts and stolen, basically. Full disclosure, I myself went to Russia for the first time at the same time. I was living in Hong Kong, and I met some guys from a trade delegation from Vladivostok. And so I wound up spending a week in Vladivostok that summer. And then I went back the following year, and I stayed for a month. And it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, it was really amazing. And it was just to talk to Russians who had just kind of emerged from the deep freeze of the Soviet Union. And I remember saying to them, you guys have such a bright future. I mean, the Russian people have this amazing intellectual history. You've got all the resources, this huge expanse. And they were like, no, we can't get out of our own way. Nothing will work. And I was like, come on, be positive. And they're like, no, we're Russians. You're an American. You think like that. We don't. I still have affection for Russians. I like learning the Russian language, even though it torments me endlessly.
So, I mean, are you implying that maybe Gibson was at the right place at the right time, and he potentially helped these fledgling new democracy enthusiasts through some stuff, or
All I can tell you is what we know,
okay,
which is that he started this company with these two guys who have not been able to reach. I reached out to the organizer of a conference that he took part in, and he gave a presentation about how to do business in secret Soviet cities. During the Soviet Union, there was a lot of secrecy, a lot of things could not access. And in particular, every Soviet city that had a nuclear power plant in it was some category of secret city. You just couldn't do business with it.
Yeah.
So the Soviet Union collapses, and all of these things that were secret are now not secret. But they sort of were tangled in this sort of skein of old laws that hadn't been abolished yet.
Yeah.
And Blaine probably perceived that there was a lot of opportunities here. There was like all this technology, there were all these scientists, and there were deals to be done. So I was able to confirm that this is true when he said like he was giving advice on companies who wanted to do business in the Soviet Union, and he particularly was dealing in a particular area of law. And I found this really interesting because in his Indiana Jones phase, he kind of came across as this bumbling, kind of sweet, slightly addled, kind of idealistic.
Yeah, I think so.
Non-entity, basically. But we know that he's smart. We know that he has like a wide variety of experience. He's like an State Department guy. He's kind of entrepreneurial. And so I talked to this guy who ran this conference that he took part in, and he said, well, frankly, it had been a couple of years and he like didn't remember it that well, because all of this is like sort of late 90s, circa 2000. And he said a lot of the people who were taking part in this conference were this sort, they would fly into like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, the big cities, and they would do business with the big money people, and then they would go back to where they came from. But Blaine, kind of not surprisingly, given what we've known about his tendency to like want to crawl around the world, he was going to all the little cities. He had this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the real Russia, you could say. Deep knowledge.
Yeah, this conference was in Obninsk, and indeed, Glenn Schweitzer, who organized it, confirmed that he was actually there.
Right.
And he said he found out to be an interesting guy because he wasn't like most of the Americans there. So, okay.
So we had earlier touched on the idea, Andy, that, well, is he really, since his French is so terrible, could his Russian really be that good? And I think that if he spent a decade traipsing around the backwaters of Russia, involving himself in areas of arcane law, and I've spent, for reasons that will become clear in future episodes, I've spent a little bit of time looking at post-Soviet legal documents, and it's like long pages of Cyrillic text. I mean, there's degrees of fluency, but you would have to have pretty strong Russian, I would say.
He did come back in 2004, and he participated, or at least he was at a U.S. Department of Commerce event in Washington, D.C. called International Travel to the U.S. Dialogue on the Current State of Play. He didn't speak. No one remembers him there. But then in between 2005 and 2008, he ran a travel company called Nason.
He seems to have been involved in this sort of marginal seeming Central Asian travel company. You can imagine them sort of being these kind of Indiana Jones-esque adventure tours to places that probably he found really fascinating, but that like was so way too weird for the mainstream.
He was a supervisor and consultant of ecological tours. Okay, well, I'm getting a sense that he did some of the stuff that he said he did. I just don't know if he did it in the way he did. But now we got to talk about the elephant, one of the many elephants in the room, and that's Vladimir Gololobov. Gololobov, who is quoted in several profiles of Gibson.
Right.
And this man describes him as a friend who met Gibson 2 decades ago while the American was in Siberia on business trips. Tell me about this guy.
Blaine is in this central part of Russia, what I had called the Ohio of Russia. He meets a young student named Vladimir Gololobov, who at the time is, I think, around 19. And Blaine, I think, himself was probably, I guess, in his 40s, okay. Right? And they form an attachment that is very long-lasting. Now, this guy, you can tell us about like where he went to school. And stuff.
So he was born in 1977. He earned his master's in English and German from one of the Russian state universities, and then he interestingly earned a master's degree in international trade policy and studies from Monterey, California Institute of International Studies.
Right.
So he was in the United States within 2 decades, and
well, he wasn't just anywhere in the United States. This is where Monterey, this area, is where Blaine is from.
Yeah, all 3 of the addresses from Gololobov are addresses that belong to Gibson.
Right.
Carmel, Monterey County, and likely they were living together.
Well, they were sharing an address, so it seems like they were living together.
And then in 2002, Gololobov moved to Washington, D.C. He started working as a lobbyist for the Coalition of Service Industries, which I don't know what that means.
Right.
But he was handling the Russian WTO session. What was he doing there? He was lobbying on behalf of the World Trade, or the Russian part of the World Trade Organization. And Gibson bought a condo in D.C. that is where Gololobov lived. And then in 2013, Gibson sold the condo to Gololobov for about $100,000 less than market value.
Right. Right. So the story is that, and the reason we're talking about all of this is that I had been publicly saying that there might be a link between MH370 and Russia, that there was a cybersecurity vulnerability in this plane, and that if it had been exploited, the plane went north to Kazakhstan and ultimately must have been taken by Russians. Debris starts turning up, and it stops turning up, and then this guy has all of this debris. All this debris is coming from the hands of this one guy who is fluent in Russian and has deep personal and business connections to Russia. And so I was like, is this coincidental? I mean, what are the odds, really?
They seem low. I should point out that we are not outing Blaine Gibson as gay. We have nothing, that there's no value in doing that, because I've certainly read some of the comments where saying like you're asserting his sexuality, that don't care. But the fact is, he had this relationship with a Russian who was fluent in English. He worked in assorted Russian legit sketchy businesses. There's some connection here that may or may not have anything to do with MH370, but this guy, his fingers are all over Russia and vice versa. Or at least he wants us to believe that, because he said it.
And again, it gets back to the question of, okay, to what extent is someone's story consistent? When I first started talking to Blaine, he was not shy about his connection to Russia. When he talked to the MetLife journalist in the months after the discoveries, he was not particularly shy about it. But in the time that passed, he came to deny that he had connections to Russia. He basically canceled his Russia Pacific company. He didn't maintain it anymore after I started writing about it. When the journalist William Langevisha actually went to Southeast Asia to meet with Blaine, he said that he had only a kind of short-term passing involvement in the tourism business in the Russian Far East, and basically pretty much denied this thing. And it's like, it kind of reminds me of when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016. He was like, yeah, no, I have nothing to do with Russia. And then it turned out that he was actually negotiating major deals. And, this idea of like lying about your involvement, it's the lying is more suspicious than the involvement almost.
In fact, you actually did get a hold of Gololobov at one point.
Eventually, I said at some point I have to reach out to this guy and say, I have all this documentary evidence that you have a long personal history with this guy.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you. I have to at least try. I didn't think he would talk to me, but I had to at least ask.
Yeah. And at first he just kind of like denied it, right?
Well, let's play it. Let's play the audio.
Okay.
Jeff Wise, I'm a journalist working on a story about MH370. And listen, I know that I don't know if your office is like all about to run off to listen to the Michael Cohen testimony.
Jeff, I really don't know anything about that. I don't know the person you were asking me about. I haven't talked to the person you were asking me about. So I'm sorry. Blaine. This is about Blaine Alan Gibson. Yes.
You're saying you don't know anything about Blaine Alan Gibson?
I haven't talked to him in a long time.
Well, could I ask you about how you know him?
No.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
So Gololobov did reluctantly admit that he knew him but not in the way that it seems like he did. But
well, he just didn't want to. He clearly just didn't want to have any involvement in it. I mean, Gololobov is now like a pretty senior. He's a lobbyist. He works in Washington, and like, doing what lobbyists do, interfacing between business and government. He's part of the same. We talked before about like the world of like foreign affairs and government affairs, and like people lobbying and people getting relationships and everything. And he's in that world. I'm sure he doesn't need to. I mean, I'm sure it's probably hard to be a Russian. I mean, it depends.
And do anything right now. Yeah. Anything legit right now, being a Russian. It's not it's not something you want to brag about.
But so for years, I've been kind of raising questions about Blaine. Blaine has continued to be a beloved figure among many, a figure of some questions among others. But, anytime someone makes a documentary about MH370, they go to ask him if he'll talk. He is a very elusive guy. Like when Langevisha tried to reach him, like he wouldn't tell what country he was in. And Blaine would talk on social media about how he was opening a bar somewhere in Southeast Asia. But and I actually reached out to because I used to know a lot of expats in Southeast Asia because I lived in Hong Kong. And so I reached out to my former network and I'm like, does anybody know where this guy's bar is? And nobody had heard of it. And we couldn't figure out if it was in Myanmar or Laos or where. And I just never really figured out where this bar was. So there's just like so many questions. And so if you want to go talk to Blaine, he'll meet you in some third country. He doesn't even want people to know where he is. And he talked a fair bit about that, like there were death threats. And I think especially like when I started to raise questions, he made it sound like I was causing him to get death threats, which I just really need to make clear. There's no reason why anything that I said about Blaine would cause someone to threaten him with death.
And seems extreme.
He's also implied that because he's been such a brave truth seeker in trying to find these pieces of debris, that his life has been in danger for that. And I really need to emphasize that even though he has found most of the pieces of debris, none of the pieces of debris that he's found have had the kind of evidentiary value that the flaperon had. And so he hasn't really moved the needle at all in terms of understanding what happened to the plane. And when people ask him, what do you think happened to the plane? He's like, I don't know. He doesn't even have a theory of what happened to this plane. So, and the third piece I want to say about these death threats is that when Langevisha asked him about his death threats, he said that there were these people that when he was looking for the lost Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia or something, that he had gotten on the wrong side of some people and they wanted to kill him. So these death threats don't even have anything to do with MH370. So there's a lot of stories and a lot of kind of verbiage that's being spread, and a lot of it's just.
So maybe he's not really getting death threats. Maybe he's being.
I think I would very much question whether he's getting death threats. And I certainly don't think he's getting death threats because of me, but I think he's throwing these around to sort of make it seem like he's being persecuted.
Yeah.
And I think, Andy, you and I know this idea of larger than life people who are constantly claiming persecution is all of a piece in a sense.
I can't imagine what you're possibly referring to, Jeff.
I don't want to antagonize people I don't need to antagonize, but,
okay.
But listen, I mean, the point is that this guy, I have been kind of a jerk. I think I've said from the get-go that all my behavior in this last 10 years, the worst behavior that I've done is in relation to him, because it kind of got under my skin, and I'm not a fully mature person maybe. But I apologize for that. But we have been somewhat at odds. I just can't, to this day, I can't make sense of how this guy can go to a beach alone among humanity. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, I know we're running really long on this, but a lot of people who say that it's not that weird that he keeps finding these pieces say that there's just a ton of pieces of MH370 lying around. So the only reason that Blaine finds so many pieces is because he's the only person looking.
Not true.
And if there were other Blaines, right, not true. If there were other Blaines, would they find so many pieces? There are other people that are looking, and we've talked before about these large-scale beach cleanups. There was one in Australia. There was another one in South Africa that was of a similar scale, a yearly beach cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
People were given out sheets saying this is what you should look for. Nothing turned up. And I talked to a guy who runs fishing tours out to sandbars in the Indian Ocean. And this is exactly the kind of place where he found no step. This is where stuff does wash up. And these guys were very much looking for stuff. And they did find at one point this kind of thing that had like nuts and bolts on it and stuff. But it wasn't from MH370. People are looking, and people did find some stuff. I mean, Blaine wasn't the only person who found stuff, but he's the only person who found stuff when he was deliberately looking for it.
Well, if I can wrap this in a nice bow, something before I even met you that I saw in the Netflix documentary that struck me as peculiar was his recognition that he knows that people think he's a spy, but he said something a little bit more specific that I thought was weird. He said, quote, "People say I'm a Russian spy. People say I'm a Chinese spy." So,
right.
Whoa. Who's saying he's a Chinese spy? What's that all about?
Well, it's about saying like, it's by making the whole allegation seem absurd. By saying like, people say I'm a Russian spy, people say I'm a Chinese spy, people say I'm a Balkan spy. It's like, no, nobody's saying any of these things. People are only saying they're a Russian spy because A, if this plane was taken north, it was taken by Russians, and B, you spent a decade in Russia, you have a long-term life partner from Russia, and
you found all the pieces.
You found all the pieces, so it's like
as if someone told you, go look here and find the pieces.
I can't. You might be completely innocent.
Do you think?
But it's not crazy to think that. I mean,
do you think? I mean, let me put you on the spot. Do you think he's a Russian spy?
So we are going to break some ground in this show, and I think that when we do, the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are going to start to fit together. And you know how it is when you make a jigsaw puzzle, you start to, whole thing fits together, and then this whole thing fits together.
Mm-hmm.
And then there comes that magical moment where like those two things fit together. And now you have a really big piece of the puzzle. So things that seem unrelated start to fit together. And so what you thought was a blank space now isn't a blank space anymore. So I will leave it at that. But I will say that when either everything is confusing and doesn't make sense, or everything fits together and everything made sense.
You want to know what I think?
Yes.
And I also know what you're talking about, so I have some advanced notice of some of this. But if I were to analyze where we are right now based on everything I've heard, I don't think he is a Russian spy as much as possibly an asset, maybe a pawn. I think that perhaps someone gave him some information about where he could look to find this stuff, and those people were Russians, and that he was just I don't think he knows the whole plot, but I think he knows enough to find his fame and fortune as Indiana Jones because someone told him where to look, and those people were Russians.
I think something that we've had occasion to think about in the last few years is how, it's not just like spies and not spies. There's all kinds of ways to get entangled. So
I don't think he's James Bond. Let me put it that way.